Time to say a very good morning to Ms. Helen Dale. Helen, how are you?
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. I'm actually quite pleased at the way that things are panning out between us and the EU, because I spoke earlier this week and said, you know that scene in Alien where Sigourney Weaver's sitting there and the big alien monster's just by her head and it's about to kind of open its jaws? That, to me, signified what the EU was showing itself to be. You know, sheep's clothing completely thrown off, wolf very visible.
Well, we often joke in this country, and the joke, it's an unkind one, but it's legitimate and fair, particularly when you go back to the early stages of the pandemic, where there was shortages of everything from hand sanitizer to bog roll to PPE.
Pasta.
Oh, everything. It was ridiculous, and we saw all of those and of course the PPE has turned into a classic HM.gov procurement disaster, and they finally sorted it out. But at the beginning, it was a classic procurement disaster, and money was wasted, and there wasn't enough of it, and all of those kind of things. Now, we're used to making those kind of criticisms of our own government in this country. Problems of state capacity tend to produce difficulties with procurement, and procurement in this country goes back to the beginning of PFI with John Major, and of course Tony Blair made it much, much worse. Now, what you have to set against that is a truly enormous unfolding procurement disaster in the European Union. Now, in the past, these kind of things were often hidden from the British public. Whilst people we know from the results of the referendum and the election didn't necessarily want to be members of the European Union, and that's why that there were clear wins for those, the individual details of these kind of procurement stuff-ups that would happen within EU countries, unless you had French or German or Dutch or Italian friends, you never heard about them. But now it's happened with the vaccine, where there is global interest, and where very foolishly the sovereign governments of the EU 27, remembering that under the treaties, health is something, and I'm going to use a British word, but is devolved to the individual countries. And that's not the correct term. It's not the term that EU lawyers would use, but it works in this context. Imagine that the leader of an individual country was Nicola Sturgeon rather than Angela Merkel, and you get the idea. It is the job of Scotland to look after NHS Scotland. It is the job of Germany to look after its health system. And one of the reasons why Merkel is so angry is because of all the EU countries at the beginning of the pandemic, Germany looked like to be, while it was doing its stuff itself, looked like to be handling it pretty well. Interestingly, another country that was handling it pretty well in the EU, even though it's a poor country, was actually Greece.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? But this is always the argument, hasn't it, been about the federal state system? Because, you'll obviously be an expert in how it works in Australia, where it seems to be slightly more kind of easy to denote who's in charge of what. Similarly, in America, people are always amazed when I explain to them that actually the president of the United States doesn't have a great deal of power over individual states and what they do in terms of, particularly during COVID, in terms of what their lockdown looks like, in terms of what their, hospital bed situation is, none of that really. Whereas
it's all in the hands of the states, the same as in Australia. And people who were having a go at Trump for COVID policy, and now I notice they're starting to attack Joe Biden. And suddenly they're having to learn that actually, no, Joe Biden can't go and tell California or North Dakota or whatever state it is that they have to do this. That's not in his gift.
Yeah, well, they're beginning to realise as well, Helen, that suddenly, the arrival of Saint Joe Biden hasn't completely and utterly transformed the world just because somebody read a poem on the steps of the bleeding Capitol,
this is the thing. But federal systems are like that. Now, the thing is, federalism can produce serious state capacity problems. We've seen that in the United States. Their federal compact doesn't seem to work properly. You are now seeing with the vaccine rollout in the European Union a type of federalism, although an Australian, I won't speak for Americans here because whilst I'm a lawyer, I'm not an American lawyer, as I always hasten to add.
Thank God for that. I know a lot of American lawyers.
But federalism can go badly wrong. And Australian lawyers will say they'll call both the EU arrangements and the arrangements of devolution in the UK, they'll call it NQF, not quite federalism.
Right.
It doesn't have the same indicia of federalism that you associate with the way the various state governments work in Germany or in Australia, which are quite similar. But this kind of divided governance arrangement, unless you have very high state capacity, doesn't work well.
No.
Works well in Australia, it works well in Germany, but it doesn't work well in the United States, and it doesn't work well in a lot of other countries, particularly where federalism is used as a way to try to solve ethnic conflicts. You just finish up with little statelets with them all fight, and that's happened in a number of African countries.
Yes, but also what we know, Helen, about the EU from our friends who went to work in Brussels for the Brexit Party is that there are people who ideologically are federalists and who wanted the EU and probably still want the EU to become the United Federation of Europe, you know, and who actively speak. I mean, I listened to, I think it's the Deputy Commissioner of the European Union, who's a former Green Party MEP from Germany, who talked about the kind of old-fashioned and rather outmoded view that nationalism was a good thing and that actually we shouldn't be nationalist at all. We should be globalist. We should be wide-thinking. We should be thinking about the whole rather than individual kind of identity.
But the problem with that, of course, is where federal states are successful, they are successful in the context of a sovereign nation state.
Yes.
Australia is a sovereign nation state. Germany is a sovereign nation state. Both countries make their federal systems work extremely well, but it's very much in the service of a sovereign nation state. Now, what happened in the EU and the root of this procurement disaster, I mean, is in that the governments of the EU 27 booted the problem upstairs. They did what we used to do in Britain when we blamed the EU for things.
Yeah.
You know, when there was something difficult, this was notorious. You know, both sides did it. We would blame the EU for something. Well, so what has happened here, because they didn't want to be responsible for fouling it up, you know, people are scared of that kind of thing. It makes you look bad. They've booted the vaccine procurement up a level to the supranational level.
Yeah.
And there's two things going on here. The EU lacks state capacity as an entity. I mean, in the same way as the UK does. But there's also, this has always been the job of the governments of the individual countries in the past.
Yes.
It's not been the job of the supranational entity. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. And so one of the things that they have managed to do legally is they've entered into a best efforts what's known as a best efforts contract. Now, best efforts or best endeavours is a clause in a contract that is traditionally designed to deal with the fact that the product is in development, so you can be less sure about delivery dates. Now, traditionally in a contract, delivery is hugely important, and there are some forms of contractual arrangements where until you get delivery, and in a Roman law country like France, it will be called traditio. Yes, the Roman word for delivery in a contract, in contract law, which was the same in the Roman Empire as it is for us, is the root of the modern English word tradition, to hand over.
Right.
Okay, so you have a best efforts or a best endeavours clause, and there are a couple of other phrases, and they are interpreted somewhat differently by the courts in different jurisdictions, when you can't be sure of the delivery date. Now, it may be that the EU's negotiators really pushed AstraZeneca, and remember there are problems with Pfizer as well, and Pfizer's factories are in the EU because they just haven't been able to scale up production quickly enough.
Yeah, but they've done a pretty good job up to now, because clearly the UK has got plenty of vaccines, as we're seeing this morning, more than enough to vaccinate the entire population. But what I find extraordinary as well, Helen, and it's good that you're explaining this to people in a legal way, is that the EU also thinks that it has jurisdiction over contracts which are made between a pharmaceutical international company and a country outside of the EU, which surely it doesn't have any legal recourse to.
Well, no, I mean, obviously, and this is another point to make, be aware that the contractual arrangements between the European Union as an entity and AstraZeneca, and I think the ones with Pfizer as well, although I'm less sure of that, but certainly the ones with AstraZeneca are subject to a non-disclosure agreement, which means that none of us can look at the documents and engage in what lawyers call contracts review. Right. So, I mean, apart from the fact that the chat from AstraZeneca has been frank about the fact that it was a best efforts contract when you're not sure of the delivery date, we don't know the full details, because a best efforts contract does not mean, oh, that means we can be slack off and not deliver the product ever.
Right.
And sometimes there are clauses built into contracts of that type that impose price penalties, for example. If the product is delivered late, then 10 or 15% of what was going to be paid for it is reduced. And you have scales set out in the annexures to the contract. That can happen as well, but none of us can see that, because we can't do contracts review because of the NDA.
Right.
But I mean, it is entirely possible the EU just couldn't get AstraZeneca or Pfizer to shift on a best efforts contract, because if you undertake to deliver on a date in a contract, unless there are very, very few ways of wriggling out of that. And what tends to happen if you are going to if you do commit to a day and you've got a product for a delivery and you've got a product in development, and it's difficult because it's a vaccine with a novel virus and all of these things, you get what's known as a frustration of the contract, or in Roman law, a force majeure, which is where the entire contract falls over. And the court's approach to this is just generally to let the losses fall where they lie.
Yeah.
And so everybody is out of pocket, and it's a complete disaster.
But this is all being driven, of course, by the EU's lack of organisation. It's their own fault that they don't have the vaccines. They were asked by individual group countries, as you said, to get on the case early. I just said to Nick Dubois in the last hour that one of the reasons why everything did get delayed, in addition to the late ordering of the vaccines, was the late approval of the vaccines, because we approved them far earlier than the EU did.
Well, yes, this is one of the things. And look, there have been serious state capacity issues in Britain. No one can deny that. I mean, that's why you've got 100,000 deaths. And per head of population, because of the vaccine cock-up, excuse my French, I hope they don't press the big red Ofcom button for that one. And because of the vaccine stuff up in EU, you're going to finish up with more deaths per head of population. But I don't normally like making forecasts, but I can be quite confident of that one by the end of this, simply because we now know the vaccine stops you getting COVID. This is
well,
the
it
thing.
stops
So
it stops you getting a bad version of COVID.
Yes, you get a little sniffle if you're going to get anything. That kind of thing. So you've got there are a lot of countries, with relatively few exceptions, have got serious state capacity issues with this. But by the same token, a lot of it is self-inflicted with the European Union.
And it's only going to get worse, Helen, isn't it? Because they're going to be faced with a lot of countries asking for preferred status, in the way that we're arguing about whether teachers or care workers or elderly people or vulnerable people or police officers should be getting the vaccine ahead of different groups. They're going to have different countries coming to them saying, well, we need it for this reason.
This is the problem.
We need it because we've got an older generation. We need it because we've got more vulnerable people. We need it because we've got more victims. We need it because we've got bigger
we've got more dark-skinned people with vitamin D deficiencies. All of that.
There's never going to be...
You can imagine people in Spain, Spain or Italy, where you've got immigrants from North Africa who are very dark and may have vitamin D deficiency. It's just, the whole thing's just a nightmare. It really is. But
which they have created for themselves. So as far as our position is concerned, Helen, let's because we might run out of time soon. As far as our position is concerned, we are standing reasonably firmly against this EU onslaught, as it would appear is AstraZeneca, who I think cancelled a meeting with them yesterday. So I think I'm not quite sure what's
going on there. But I mean, one thing I will say about this is that there's been lots of cock-ups along the way in the UK. But if the NHS was built for anything, it's a mass vaccine rollout. And unsurprisingly, it's doing a very good job. If that type of health entity where it's all effectively nationalised, so it's not part private the way it is in France or Germany or Australia, is set up to do anything incredibly well, it will be a vaccine rollout. And full credit to them, the vaccine rollout in this country is being managed at this point and giving every sign of continuing spectacularly well, and that has to be acknowledged, even allowing for all the other procurement stuff-ups that we had back at the beginning and problems that we had that undoubtedly contributed to more deaths. You know, the care home debacle and the PPE debacle. Yeah, this kind of thing.
But that, of course, is something which it would appear, in terms of the organisation of the vaccinations, we have learned from. And, you know,
Yes.
the government doesn't get praised for very much. But I think most people, even those who hate the government and hate Boris Johnson, have to reluctantly say, oh, yes, they've done quite well there. Because I think we've done brilliantly.
Yeah, no, the vaccine rollout. I mean, some of the state capacity issues that Britain developed as a result of being a member of the European Union, you can't deny this. This is when you continually kick jobs upstairs and then they're done badly and you blame the other lot for doing them badly, but you can't leave. That's how your state capacity atrophies, basically. But some of the state capacity is starting to show, the residual state capacity that is part of the Westminster system. The NHS vaccine rollout as an example, and also the competence of the deal negotiation that Lord Frost led.
Yes.
That's another example. It's starting to come back, but it's not an instant thing. And I'm quite confident when I predict that the last government entity that will find its way out of the state capacity hole that it's in will be the Home Office.
Yes.
You know, they've always been the weakest.
Yes, well, these are the people who, of course, are now locking down the borders, Helen. Listen, thanks very much indeed. And we've got to run. Helen Dale, writer, lawyer, political commentator, of course, talking there about the state of the EU and the state that they are in, the federal state that they are in. It's only going to get worse for them. They're going to have a massive problem over the course of the next few weeks and months, rolling out the vaccine to all the different countries who are all going to be clamouring for it in different ways, shapes and forms.